Many of us are still busy finalizing our crop plan for the 2025 season, so I thought this would be a good time for me to share some learnings that I made over the last 3 years of flower farming. My approach to crop planning in year 3 looked drastically different than in year 1. So in this video, we're going to have a very visual reflection of what the field looked like in year 1 when I got peak blooms versus all of the mistakes that I made in year 1 that I wanted to avoid, and how that changed how I crop plan in year 3. So this video is going to be particularly helpful for those who are either completely new to flower farming, and perhaps this video might alter some of the flowers that you grow, or more specifically the timing of those flowers, or for people who have had a couple of seasons under their belt but are trying to fine tune when they want peak production because they're flower farming part-time and want to be a little bit more strategic about growing. So if you're new to my channel, my name is Jessie. I live in zone 7A in New Jersey, and I am entering into my 4th year of flower farming. So I've been selling both retail and wholesale, which also impacts crop planning, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But really what I want to emphasize is that the major realization between year 1 and year 3 is that timing of blooms matter, especially depending on what types of channels you're selling in. Now, having sold in both retail and wholesale, I can tell you that summer tends to be a slower season for most people. And that's because people start going on vacation. There are actually fewer weddings happening just because it is so hot outside. So of course, this depends on where you live. But for the most part, I felt that in year 1, all of my peak blooms were happening at a time when no one was there to buy my flowers. And that was because I did not understand how to properly time my blooms. So that's what I was able to avoid in year 3. So let's actually get started and talk about just the timeline and the progression of events in year 1. And then I'm going to contrast that with year 3. If you are a Patreon member or you're interested, for $5 a month, you can get access to a more detailed version of what I'm talking about on my Patreon. We have an adjacent article that really goes through specifically in year 3 aerial shots of my field, so you can see exactly what the field looked like from April all the way through October, the progression of certain types of crops, when I flip things, and so forth. So let's start with year 1. To give you some context, year 1 was my first year. We had just moved to this property, so it felt a bit like we were jumping out of a plane and building a parachute on the way down, because we were still clearing the field of sod, putting up deer fence, and all while trying to get crops in. So what that meant was, in the very early months of spring, such as April, I did not have tulips, since we did not live here, for me to be able to put in tulips in the previous fall. But what's really important at this time is, I think a lot of beginner growers, including myself, get really, really excited for the upcoming season, and we tend to start warm loving annuals at this time. We tend to want to push the envelope, getting them started a little bit earlier, and perhaps not waiting enough time to put them out into the field. And so one of the things I learned was that if you start your warm loving annuals too early and the ground is too cold, obviously they're not going to do very well. So at this time in year 1, in early April, I was starting things like celosia, zinnia indoors. I had planted out some of the snapdragons that I had started out in early January, which was totally fine and in accordance to schedule, but I was just too eager on the warm loving annuals, and I also had started some straw flower at this point. By late April, still no flowers, and I was at this point direct seeding sunflowers, as well as things like cosmos outside. I was even putting dahlia tubers outside. So late April is a time when it's still fluctuating in temperature in our zone. You might still get some nights of really cold weather, sometimes frost, but for the most part, the ground is workable. And because we were preparing the land and taking off the sod, it did make the soil a little bit more workable in our case. Now we get into May, and at this point I had actually signed up for a farmer's market. I committed to being at the farmer's market every other weekend, and in my head I thought, okay, I'm going to be able to have blooms by the end of May, because the snapdragons that I put in April are going to start blooming by then, and I'll figure things out. So I can tell you that in the month of May, I had no flowers at all. I ended up buying in flowers from other flower farmers. So, for example, I was actually able to source tulips for the first market, which was the 1st of May that year. When I think about what I did during that month of May, there was a lot more direct seeding of those warm loving annuals. I was just trying to do everything to try to get as many blooms as possible without actually thinking about when they would come in and if they would all come in at the same time. So you're starting to see where I'm going over here, because now for the month of June, this is where the flowers start coming in. Now, I will say that I was really surprised at how late my flowers came in June. The first stem for my sunflowers came in on June 13th. So we're talking about mid-June. I basically went a month and a half or 4 markets without my own flowers. I had to completely source from another place. I think I missed one of those markets because I had COVID, but I was left without flowers for a longer time than I had expected. So first sunflower came in on 6/13. First zinnia came in on the 17th. First snapdragon came in on the 21st of June. And so what we saw in June was that I had a lot of blooms just starting to come in. They weren't necessarily peaking at that time, but it was clear that the field was on its way to being in peak production within a couple of weeks. And I had estimated that that would probably be around the July 4th timeframe. So I was really excited. Remember, year 1, waiting for all these flowers to bloom. And so you're just like on the edge of your seat waiting for that. So that brings us to July, which did not disappoint. I really started getting my blooms in July, and I would say that the mother lode of my harvests came on July 8th. So if you have been selling for a while, you'll know that really July 4th and beyond gets really, really slow. That being said, I actually had a really great market on July 8th. I did a video up here, and I think it's because I overstuffed my bouquets and priced them really low. They're $15. So looking back, I think that I did well because the bouquets were basically a steal. And that's not a bad thing because I got rid of all of my stems, but it was a lot of work for basically that one market. And honestly, I felt a little bit burnt out afterwards. I continued to get more blooms in July and finding it increasingly more difficult to sell at that farmer's market because the foot traffic just kept on declining. And I would say that the foot traffic really didn't start picking up until late August, closer to Labor Day weekend. So it was really disappointing to be sweating out in the field, harvesting, making all these bouquets, and really feeling like I was swimming against a current trying to sell them at my farmer's market. But if we go past July 8th, I started seeing some celosia around mid-July on July 18th. And then the second succession of big sunflowers that I had happened on July 25th. But what also started happening around that time was I started getting powdery mildew on my zinnias. I would say that I had a ton of zinnias throughout the month of July, but they really started puttering out. So I really only got one true succession out of them. And that is something that I've continued to experience over the last 2 years, which is the fact that it's hard for me to get more than one succession of zinnias, no matter when I plant them, because of powdery mildew. So what's also happening in July at this time? Well, my pathways started getting really, really weedy. And it's because when we were preparing the field, I took the easy way out. I didn't lay any cardboard in some of the pathways. And so we ended up spending our evenings in mid-July, this was July 11th, really doing a lot of weed management, laying more cardboard on, putting wood chips on. We didn't have a tractor at this time, so this was really, really manual labor work. And props to Eric for helping me do this. I was also putting in more plugs, so I had snapdragons that were going to the ground to prepare for the fall, and I also was succession planting more sunflowers. I planted a lot of sunflowers in year 1. July was a really, really hard month. And that leads me to August. By the time we got to August, I was burnt out. I was so burnt out because July felt not only like a struggle in terms of working against Mother Nature in the form of humid and hot weather, the pests and the weed pressure, but also a bit of feeling like defeat because I had all these flowers and they were not going anywhere. And in year 1, you're asking yourself, is it me or is it the market? So looking back now, having 3 years under my belt, I can tell you that it's probably more the market than it is you, especially if you've grown nice, good, robust stems. All right, so August comes and now we start getting other crops that are in full bloom. So we have gomphrena, which I learned I planted way too many of. Gomphrena is not fun to harvest in my book. And since that first season, I have vowed to never grow gomphrena again. But I started getting a little bit more of the dahlias coming in. And in August, all of my zinnias were basically unusable. This is a photo from August 17th. You can see the powdery mildew taking over. I was just so overwhelmed that I didn't even have time to pull them out of the ground. And of course, the powdery mildew just builds up over time to the point where if you wait, it becomes even more of a pain to take them out because you're basically unable to touch any part of the stem that doesn't have any sort of powdery mildew. By August 22nd, the cosmos that were coming in were a little bit pathetic looking, and I think it's because I grew the wrong type of cosmos. I was growing some shorter varieties. I had a lot more success growing cosmos in year 3. We'll talk about that later. But some of the other plugs that I planted in earlier in July started coming in. So I didn't mention this, but I did put in some Selway celosia plugs. And so these started pumping out stems in later August. So this is August 24th. August 31st, some of the Madame Butterfly Snapdragon plugs that I put in were flowering, but they really struggled in the heat. They were really short, and I've come to learn that Madame Butterfly is just a little bit more fragile, and it's probably, it's a really beautiful Snapdragon, but probably not one that I'm going to plant just because of how I can't get it to create more robust stems than some of the other types of Snapdragons that I've planted. And really the takeaway in August was that I struggled to make balanced looking bouquets because I had all this gomphrena, I had some sunflowers, some dahlias, but really that was it. And I would say the most amount of flowers I had was gomphrena. So there's only so much you can do with gomphrena. I even tried selling straight bunches of gomphrena, which didn't really work. Of course, you can dry gomphrena, so I started doing that, but I'm just not the type of person who's going to be doing crafts in winter and trying to sell that. So it just felt like it was a really big waste of space and labor that I was trying to do in order to harvest all of that gomphrena. I will also say that at this point in August, I knew that I was pregnant. So I did make a plan with a local grower friend, Jess, and she had helped me start seedlings to overwinter for the spring of the following season. And that was all with intention that I wouldn't have to do any transplanting when I was in my 3rd trimester. So at that point in August, I was actually putting in seedlings into the ground to overwinter. And I finished putting all those seedlings in September. So that takes us to September. September 2nd, the Selway harvest was really peaking. The dahlias were really starting to come into their prime. And it became a bit easier to make bouquets, but it never felt like that I had the abundance or the ability to make balanced bouquets as easily as I did in year 3. And I think I chalked that up to just not having enough variety to work with. I had enough stems, but things just felt off. And especially when you're in your first year, you just don't have the experience of making bouquets. It made the process that much more challenging and a little bit defeating, honestly. So I got all 1,000 seedlings into the ground for the spring, and I will say that by the time the end of September came, I was kind of done. Throughout the entire season, I basically had to supplement by buying flowers from that grower friend Jess. She was an established grower, had a lot of growing experience underneath her belt, didn't necessarily have a market to sell to. So she almost became my wholesale supplier, and I would sell the blooms at the farmer's market. I learned a lot in that first season. I mean, when I had an excess of stems, I got really creative. I was using Facebook Marketplace to push off stems. I did a video here where I sold over $1,000 in a weekend. Again, they were lower price type of bouquets. It's not something I would do again, but I learned a lot in the process. And so when I took a step back after year 1, I mean, I honestly didn't need to wait for the winter to take that step back and reflect. I knew in July that once I realized traffic was going to be slow, I said, I'm not doing this again next year, especially with a baby. I'm going to shift everything. So let's actually now shift over and talk about year 3, which was this past 2024 season, and now how the crop planning looked and therefore the results of that shift. So let's start with some fundamentals in terms of mental thinking that I shifted. First, I said to myself that I would be optimizing my flower production for later spring as well as late summer, early fall. At this point, I had done winter tulip forcing, and winter tulips were one of my biggest crops in the winter time, and it's a lot of work. So I knew that I wanted some downtime, especially in the early spring. This was coupled with the fact that I am not willing to babysit ranunculus. I do not have a high tunnel, and especially if you're growing outside, I did not have the means to go outside to cover, uncover, especially since I still have to go to the office about 3 times a week. So knowing the fact that I was not going to be serious about growing ranunculus and that I needed a break, I decided that I was going to basically sacrifice the month of May and really focus on production coming in June. And I also knew that I wanted to take July off from selling intensively. So I still sold in July, just didn't sell wholesale at the cooperative and sold mostly through this country retail store, which was less pressure. And I would use that time to really focus on that late summer fall production. So what did that entail? That entailed not starting any warm loving annuals from seed until July 4th. July 4th became my new goalpost date for starting those warm loving annuals. So for example, I started my floret zinnia seeds during that July 4th weekend. And you're going to see that they basically bloomed exactly at the time that I wanted them to. I really want to hammer home the point that you don't have to be intensively farming in July. You could be taking a break. Are you going to be missing out on some sales? Yeah, of course you are. But I just don't think that you're going to have a high enough volume of sales that really warrants the amount of time and effort that you need to spend, especially if you're doing this part-time, because the last thing you want to do is really burn out ahead of the busier fall season. All right, so let's actually start going through this month by month, similar to what we did in year 1. So in year 3, early April, tulips. Tulips start blooming, and outside of harvesting tulips, Lisianthus plugs are going into the ground, as well as some bells of Ireland, which were a new crop that I grew this year. I really love the bells of Ireland. I just think that putting them in April was actually a little bit late. So I'm actually trying to overwinter them for an earlier bloom in the spring next year. Our nights in April are still fairly unpredictable. Sometimes we'll still get frost. In fact, our first or our last frost really isn't until, we'll call it, around Mother's Day. That's kind of the goalpost that a lot of home gardeners have. So you're never truly out of the danger zone until early mid-May at the earliest. And by late April, still harvesting tulips. And this time around, I'm very diligent about being on top of the weeds, because once you let some of the weeds go out of control, they are going to just exponentially go out of control. So I learned weed management earlier in spring is important. And this doesn't just mean pulling the weed out. It means if you're seeing aggressive rhizomes, putting on another layer of cardboard and putting wood chips on top, and that really helped manage the situation for me. Not to mention the fact that we've been practicing no dig for the last 3 years, and I do think that's finally starting to pay dividends on that front. So May comes around, and again, May, I'm taking a bit of a break. We do have Mother's Day around this time, so I have some tulips saved up from April that I put in my refrigerator. I have a little bit of Sweet William that has basically perennialized from the past season, and I'm buying in stems in order to hit that Mother's Day market. But really what it involves in the field is still continued maintenance of weeding, some watering if there's not enough rain, and then I'm at the most direct seeding some cosmos into the ground in later that month. So you can see that it's a relatively light start of the year for me based off of this model. June becomes this month powered by perennials. It's all about the perennials. At this point, the sea holly, the yarrow, some of the other stuff that I've kind of just like slowly perennialized. I call them the short-lived perennials like foxglove. Some of the self-seeded spring crops are also coming in like nigella. I really don't need to do a lot of work to get these blooms is the point, right? So I'm focusing on June on selling both wholesale and retail, but I actually didn't do a ton of work to get these flowers because the work was already done years before, either through perennializing them or through overwintering. So June is a focus on harvesting as well as pest scouting, specifically here with regards to thrips. So I mentioned earlier that I had snapdragons that were riddled with thrips. Talking with other local growers, it just seems like you're really not going to be able to avoid thrips especially if you're not going to spray. But even if you're going to spray, it's still really hard to avoid them. So what I do is I try to get my snaps before Memorial Day weekend, or I plant snaps a lot later so that they will flower either in late summer or early fall. And that's exactly what I did this time around. I put snapdragon plugs into the ground in late June and I got blooms from them in September. And of course, you have to pick the right groups that are going to be able to survive the hot, humid summer heat for this. All right, so June, I mentioned all about the perennials. I didn't talk about the lilies, so I had a lot of lilies that perennialized. June is typically a hard time for people to have a consistent focal. And that's where the lilies really shined for me because I always was able to make a really balanced bouquet. I think that it's actually pretty easy in the month of June to be able to achieve a balanced bouquet because if you don't want lilies, there are peonies that will start blooming sometime in like May through June. Even roses. I think roses where we are start puttering out by end of May, but there are certain varieties of roses that still can do well in June. Of course, they are also prone to thrips. But the point is that you have actually a lot of options in the spring to be able to churn out a decent amount of good looking balanced bouquets without as much work. That brings us to my least favorite month for flower farming, which is July, because it's so hot, so humid, so much pest pressure. So again, I take a step back from selling, but I am focusing all my efforts on getting peak blooms basically 6 to 8 weeks after this time frame. The days to maturity are really short at this time frame because you've got longer day length coupled with higher heat, which accelerates growing. So if you start something from seed or direct seed in July, you could potentially get blooms as early as 6 weeks to 8 weeks after. So we're talking about hitting late August as well as early September for some of these crops. So I still have crops in the ground that are blooming in July. Let's actually start with that. I have Lysianthus that starts blooming in July, but it really actually doesn't start blooming for me until the last few weeks of July, even for the earlier groups. If I'm planting a later group, like a group 3 or group 4, I don't get those blooms until August. So again, I'm timing everything to make sure that I'm not getting a peak abundance of blooms in July because I'm not focused on selling in July. If I have stems that are blooming in earlier July and they're not premium stems, I'm honestly just letting them go. So for example, I did have the Cosmos come in a little bit earlier than I had anticipated. Some of those initial Cosmos stems just got cut, and because they're cut and come again, they regenerated and gave me a later flush. But I'm still providing a few bouquets a week to that retail store, so I still have an outlet, but I'm not selling wholesale. So my primary outlet is basically not an option at this point. So what kind of work am I doing in July outside of direct seeding those Cosmos and zinnias? I am transplanting in plugs. So beds get flipped. The Bells of Ireland bed got flipped to marigolds. Kind of hard to see here, but the marigold plugs are in here, just very, very tiny. I put in ageratum plugs into the ground too, as well as some stock. So stock is one of those crops where you definitely need shade cloth if you're trying to hit them for fall. And dahlias. At this point, dahlias are putting on bushy growth. I'd actually put those tubers in sometime in like late April, early May. And so with the longer day length, they're putting on bushy growth. I'm netting stuff, so I'm making sure that the dahlias are netted. The Lysianthus are typically netted by like late June at the latest. So again, lots of maintenance happening right now. And I would say that this past July, weed pressure was actually really manageable. Of course, I still had to do some weeding, but it didn't feel anywhere near as bad as years prior. So all of that work in July gets us to August. And August to me was all about keeping up with the harvest. I can kind of take that step back because I don't need to think about succession planting. I'm not trying to really get past the first couple of weeks of October. I'm really trying to maximize my production for back to school. So we're talking about like a couple of weeks before Labor Day and really with the first couple of weeks of September, because I find that weddings as well as just general retail sales do a lot better then. August, I get my main flush of Lysianthus. They do really well for me retail. Cosmos, the second succession is starting to come in. With the Celosia, they're actually starting to peak, especially in later parts of August. We're getting marigolds that are budding up, about to bloom. Stocks also showing some buds, and dahlias do start really pumping out their blooms during the last week of August. So again, like this is exactly where I want to be, because that gets us to September, which now is like just peak harvest time. And I would say that the field looked its best in September, which might actually sound counterintuitive, but again, like you can plan your crop cycle so that you can hit a certain month of peak production. I had so many marigolds, they were like coming out of my ears. Tons of celosia that continue growing because my celosia was just so productive from this self-seeded celosia that we had. The Cosmos last succession was starting to come in. Dahlias really give their most abundant blooms within the first 2 weeks of September for us here. And rose lilies. I actually had planted a small succession of rose lilies back in July, so these were also pumping out blooms. And I would say that September is my goalpost for making sure if there's anything that I want over winter for spring of next year, I get those plugs into the ground. So delphinium as well as bells of Ireland were put into the ground at this time. September ended up being kind of like the last month for me of a big harvest, just because my daughter's diagnosis started really weighing on me mentally and even a bit physically. So I still sold some retail bouquets in October and in late September, but this is the last photo of the major haul that I had to bring down to the cooperative. I was actually really proud of this haul, because this haul, or this photo over here, really represents the success in this crop planting that I had, this intentionality that I had in terms of when I wanted peak blooms. So to wrap up this video, I encourage you to think about your sales outlets. Do you need consistent blooms? If you're selling at a farmer's market, you may not really have as much flexibility in terms of what I'm talking about here. But if you're selling at a roadside stand that you get to control, if you're working with a small business where there's flexible expectations, you might want to pull back a little bit on summer. You might want to think a little bit more about using that time this summer to make sure that you're not only recharging, but also maximizing the field so that you can get more abundant blooms later in the season when people actually want to buy those flowers. So drop me questions in the comments. Let me know how you crop plan. Are there any times that you try to hit? Any times you try to take time off? And in the meantime, before we get to the next video, here is a quick update on E.